So it's 1974, and Colonel Parker has sold off most of Elvis's catalog for upfront cash, and he gets a grand scheme going on in his head, as Colonel Parkers are wont to do. He comes up with this idea of, well, they own all the music. What if we put out an album that's an Elvis concert without the music? This seriously happened. In 1974, they put out an album called Having Fun with Elvis on Stage. Now, this album I've actually had for a really long time. It's not in very good condition anymore. In fact, it's very floppy. It was held together for, it seems like, many years by tape from whoever the fan was that originally owned this. Very well loved, apparently, this album. But I've actually had this since like the mid 2000s, and I've always found it a very fascinating release. Now, this was released. This is a later release that actually did come out on RCA, but originally it came out on the Boxcar label, which was Colonel Parker's record label. And because he had an archive of shows that had been recorded, which have actually fed basically the ability for Follow That Dream, Elvis's sub-label now, to release Elvis concerts from throughout his career. But they put out this album that's a talking album only. In fact, there's a little disclaimer, I think, in the upper corner that says a talking album only. There's one up here as well. And in the back, you have the cities that Elvis played throughout 1970 through 1974 that were all sold out across the continental United States. And there's, of course, a promotion for you to hear Elvis on RCA Records and Tapes, see Elvis in concert for RCA Record Tours. And then there's one credit on this album: executive producer for this recording project, Elvis. Not Elvis Presley, just Elvis. Which I don't believe, because, I mean, obviously he didn't. There's no way that Elvis would sit down with an engineer and go through the hundreds of hours of tapes of his concerts and pick out the funniest parts, which, to be fair, some of these are actually quite funny. I re-listened to this for this review. It's the first time I've listened to it in probably over 10 years, and it's still a fascinating listening experience, because you kind of go through phases while you're listening to it. You start off and you're like, oh, well, this is different. And then you get partway through it and it's kind of interesting. And it's like, oh, well, that's, he makes some funny comments. And a lot of it is him singing, whoa, 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 whoa. Or you'll hear the a piano intro of I Can't Stop Loving You. And he'll cue it up as saying something like, you know what else I can't do? I can't stop loving you. But instead of going into the song, he'll actually say, like, I can't sing 4 songs at once, or something like that. Trying to be, just playing with the audience and having fun on stage. And so as you hear some of these snippets, and especially on side A, you get to a portion where Elvis actually, it's from 1969, and it's Elvis giving a monologue about his life story. And it's pretty heavily edited down from other versions that I've heard, which tend to be a lot funnier and a lot more lengthy. But he essentially gives his own little autobiography as a comedy routine. And that in itself, honestly, is worth the price of admission on this. But again, that's on side A. You get to side B, and it just sort of starts to descend from there. And it just sort of becomes repetition of some of the same types of clips and the same types of comments. And the one thing that I started thinking as I was listening to this tonight was, it's important to remember that Elvis's concert performances didn't exist in a vacuum where only the song performances mattered. Like, he was an entertainer, and it's nice to hear him entertaining people. And he actually even, there's comments that are snipped out where he's, telling folks that they're a really good audience. And not just, like, every entertainer typically does that as part of their show, but having been someone who's performed not live music but live theater, performing for an audience can like actually be good or bad. Like sometimes that's not just the thing that people say. Depending on how good of a response you're getting from an audience can really impact how good your performance is. If you don't have a very engaged audience, which I can imagine happened pretty often, especially in Las Vegas, sometimes you do want to thank an audience, and it's nice to hear Elvis entertaining. The problem is that Elvis's concerts also didn't exist in a vacuum where only those little bits existed. So you don't hear context for where all these bits are fitting in, and oftentimes there's like little like plucks on guitar strings or whatever where if you're a keen-eared Elvis fan, you can hear that they're about to go into Hound Dog, or you can hear that they're just coming out of, I Was the One, or whatever song they were thinking, or even Can't Stop Loving You or whatever. But it's you don't get that. You don't get the song itself because it's a talking album only. And I don't think anyone was really ever snookered into buying this. I think it's pretty clear that it's, a talking album only. And even if you did get it, you wouldn't judge this as a rock and roll. I mean, I've seen some rock critics that have called this the worst rock and roll album of all time, or the worst. But like, there's literally no rock and roll. So how can you call it a rock and roll album when there's no rock and roll? It's just a guy, and some people have criticized it as it's not really a comedy album either. And it's like, it wasn't trying to be. It's not really trying to be any of those things. All it is Colonel Parker had a grand idea for selling an Elvis record using the bits and pieces that he actually thought he had the rights to. And as it turns out, he didn't, because RCA ended up taking it back over from him, because they were like, hey, those concerts, those were included in part of the deal that you gave, so that's ours. We own that now, and that's how you get the RCA version of this album. But it's an interesting listen, and in fact, I'm actually going to recommend to Gurdeep for TCB Cast that we actually sit down and review this at some point in the near future, because it was interesting. It was a really interesting listen, and like I said, you go through some phases, and at the end of it, you kind of go, yeah, this isn't a great album, but was it really supposed to be? This is going to be for the most fanatic of fanatical Elvis fans, which are still out there. Are they still out there? And that's it. And yet, there are still some interesting thoughts that can come out of it. So, that was having fun with Elvis on stage.